The glass walls of the boardroom reflected the winter light like a shallow lake. Seattle lay beyond in a sheet of quiet silver. But inside ArcLight Systems, the air felt thin, as if someone had climbed too fast and left the oxygen behind. At the head of the table, Dylan Rourke folded his hands, smiled without warmth, and said the word that would move a hidden fault line under the company. Bloated. He let the syllables drift, then added, leaner operations, agile restructuring. The phrases landed with the soft thud of packaging foam. Chairs shifted, pens clicked. A few people stared down at their notes as if the paper might explain what would happen next. 3 seats away, Morgan Hale watched in silence. Morgan had learned long ago that silence is often the sharpest tool in the drawer. She had used it for 14 years at ArcLight Systems, a contractor that lived at the narrow bridge between civilian technology and defense work. She had weathered 2 chief executives, one near-field audit in 2019 that could have broken the company in half, and a dozen near misses that never made it into a slide deck. Her title was Director of Regulatory and Compliance. Inside the building, people called her the one who kept the doors unlocked. Her desk at home carried her habits like fingerprints, a worn checklist book, a kitchen timer she used when she turned lights off at night, 3 clicks back from the hour because her late husband once teased that she trusted clocks more than people. She smiled at that memory sometimes. Then she returned to her work and made sure that the documents which proved ArcLight's honesty were not only signed, but defensible. Under her care, the company's legal skeleton had taken a shape that held. After the crisis in 2019, she helped design a framework that aligned with federal acquisition rules and their defense supplement. She stitched process into practice. Identity was bound to authority. Access was tied to training. And for the most sensitive certifications, a federal identity system verified the person who signed, not just the device they used. Morgan carried a government-issued identity card for that purpose, the kind that rests in a reader and turns a simple signature into a verified act. On her keychain, a hardware security token waited, like a small metal promise that the person at the keyboard was exactly who she claimed to be. That design had one visible seam. A small set of exemptions, born out of the 2019 emergency, were granted on the condition that a single, named officer would steward them until the company completed a lengthy re-vetting and re-registration cycle. The timeline was 90 to 180 days. The budget for that cycle was frozen twice. The freeze outlived the caution that caused it. Now the new chief operating officer stood in the boardroom and tried to make velocity out of words. On screen, a brief lower third would be tasteful and quiet. Love office drama with real stakes? Subscribe for more. It would slip away without breaking the room. Pressure had not invented Dylan's plan. It had only hurried it. The board chair, Elaine Porter, needed earnings before interest and taxes to rise by 2.5% before the bank would extend the company's credit terms on favorable ground. A consulting firm named Baybridge Partners had provided a deck that was easy to sell and hard to execute. Outsource back-office functions, consolidate vendors, reduce headcount in legal and compliance. They promised more than a full percentage point of margin with a few clean cuts. The chief financial officer had offered a quiet warning about the single point of risk in the compliance architecture. The phrase, temporary by design, appeared in his memo. He read the memo, believed the risk could be filled quickly, and set the meeting anyway. He cleared his throat. "We are realigning costs to regain focus," he said. "Human resources will be organized around core services and experience. Payroll will be consolidated, and elements of the compliance function will transition to an external partner that offers the same capability at scale." He paused for a reaction. The room gave him a respectful silence. That silence did not belong to him. Morgan looked at the slide. No vendor had yet been named for the work that involved federal signatures. No plan described how a new officer would be trained, verified, and registered before the quarter closed. She met Dylan's eyes. His expression was confident, as if the mountain would learn to be a road simply because he asked it to. She did not argue. She did not interrupt. When he opened the table for closing notes, she spoke once and only to clarify scope. My duties include the stewardship of exemptions that are tied to a named compliance officer. Those exemptions cannot be transferred by internal policy. They require government coordination and a new designation. He smiled, as if he had complimented the polish on his idea. "We will handle the paperwork," he said. "Our partner has done this before." Morgan nodded. She opened the small leather folio beside her. She slid a compact drive across the table toward the human resources representative. Final report. It contains my formal sign-off logs, pending certifications, flagged vendor concerns, and a 6-month audit trail. Please upload it before my credentials are deactivated, according to the internal offboarding schedule. "How long is that?" the human resources representative asked. Too quickly. 42 minutes. No one moved. Somewhere beyond the glass, a ferry in Elliott Bay gave a single long horn. Inside, the sound felt like a distant door closing. Dylan leaned back, laced his fingers, and performed an easy laugh. "This is process. We are not launching a rocket. Paperwork is paperwork." Morgan studied him for a beat. She thought of the winter that she had slept in the office during the near audit, not out of fear, but out of duty, and how many layers of quiet labor it had taken to make the company seem simple again on the outside. She reached into the folio one more time. She placed her government identity card on the table. It was a plain object, dark plastic with a federal seal that did not invite commentary. She set her hardware security key beside it, a small bright shape against the wood. The director of finance stopped taking notes. The legal counsel lifted her head. The intern by the wall looked from the card to Morgan and back again, as if a line in a book had started speaking out loud. Dylan chuckled, soft and dismissive. "Is this your way of protesting?" he asked. "It is not a protest," Morgan said. Her voice was level. "It is protocol." He waved a hand. "We will have people overseas sign whatever needs to be signed. You have made this sound far more complex than it is." Morgan did not correct him. She was careful with conclusions that the other person would have to live inside. She looked at the human resources representative again. "Please upload the materials. Your team will need them before the hour ends." Dylan exhaled and gathered his papers. "Then we are finished here." Morgan stood. The room was suddenly full of small sounds, a chair foot against carpet, a notebook closing, the hum of the projector losing its source. She slid her chair back into place and smoothed the sleeve of her jacket. When she looked up, she chose each word as one chooses a code that must unlock a door only once. "This is not symbolic," she said, touching the edge of the card with 2 fingers. "It is a federal designation." The line held in the air like a bell after the strike. Saturday opened like a blank ledger. Morgan Hale stood at the kitchen counter with the calm of a surgeon before a deliberate cut. She brewed coffee, set the cup aside untouched, and logged in one final time. Her hands did not tremble. The cursor blinked once, twice, and then she began to remove herself from the machine she had built. She revoked her soft tokens one by one, as if closing windows in a long hallway. She disassociated the hardware security key that had lived on her keychain like a small, steady star. She scrubbed the biometric backup that had once been created for a blizzard week when the office slept on cots. "Are you sure you want to revoke credential set MHACA Authority Level 4? The system asked. She approved with the steadiness of a final signature written in good light. On the desk beside her, a leather address book lay open to a page turned down years ago. She lifted the receiver of a landline that still rang with a sound that belonged to quieter decades. "Lisa McKay," a voice answered, brisk and clear. "Lisa, this is Morgan Hale," she said. I am calling to confirm that, effective immediately, I no longer serve as the designated compliance officer for ArcLight Systems. A formal notice will follow. A breath on the other end. Not surprise so much as recognition. Understood. Thank you for the courtesy, Lisa said. I will mark your designation as pending replacement and flag the exemptions for review on Monday. Morgan ended the call and composed 2 sentences. The first went to the Internal Revenue Liaison, who knew her name by the cadence of her documentation. The second went to the General Services Administration. Effective immediately, I am no longer the designated compliance officer for ArcLight Systems. She read each sentence once, as if to bless its accuracy, and sent them into the cold distance. Outside, a narrow beam of winter sun reached across the floorboards. She lifted the mug and took her first sip. She tasted the end of labor and the beginning of quiet. What followed did not require her presence. The systems did not crash with noise. They dimmed step by step as if a careful hand lowered a row of switches in sequence. On the Federal Registry portal, the company's page shifted from active to a shade that implied in review, and beneath that, suspended pending DCO update. On the contract modification platform, a banner appeared that read, "No active designated compliance officer on file." In the procurement and invoicing environment used by defense partners, submissions returned with a single sentence, "Invalid DCO electronic signature." A workflow, elegant in its design and merciless in its requirements, refused to advance because the signer, Morgan Hale, ECA, was marked inactive. Automated messages arrived from audit and security agencies requesting verification of recent internal certifications. The Treasury system placed holds on payments flagged for non-compliant signatory authority. Each event was a light going from green to amber to red. Each light was a sentence in a language that Morgan had always understood. By Monday at dawn, ArcLight's hallways carried the hush that visits offices before a storm. A team lead from procurement stood over a printer tray as if watching a tide come in. Lines rolled across the page, hold notices, escalation notices, requests for clarification, written without anger and without comfort. In the war room, the first meeting began without coffee. The chief executive officer spoke into the middle distance as if the problem might be soothed by tone. The founder, Richard Ames, sat with both hands on the table, fingers locked, eyes older than they had been on Friday. Leo Barrett opened a diagram on a screen. "No one has locked anything," he said, and his voice did not accuse. "The system is functioning as designed. For certain authorizations, there is a person-bound designation. The role is verified through federal identity. The electronic certificate serves as a keystone for non-repudiation. When that certificate is removed, the workflow requires a new designated officer." Silence met him. Then Dylan Rourke leaned forward, searching for a quick road through a mountain. "Who else can sign temporarily? Can legal appoint an acting officer while we transition?" General Counsel, Carla Nguyen, shook her head once. The gesture was small and absolute. Federal Acquisition Regulation and the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement do not accept internal substitution for designated roles. Signatures are legally bound to identity and training. Attempting to sign in the name of a former officer or directing another to do so may constitute fraud. Dylan clasped his hands, released them, clasped them again. He was not a villain in this room. He was an intelligent man whose map had been sold without mountains. Now he understood that the bridge had always been a person, and the person had stepped away. Richard left the table and returned with a paper folder that he had kept in the back of a drawer since 2019. He laid a memo on the table. It was the memo Morgan had written after the near audit. the one that had set the new architecture in place. He read the first paragraph, then the second, then stopped before the third. The designated compliance officer role is non-substitutable without full reauthorization through issuing agencies. Internal corporate policy cannot overwrite federal designation. His signature sat at the bottom like a small, bright nail driven into wood. Dylan's shoulders lowered. The breath he let out was not dramatic. It was the sound of certainty leaving a plan. He thought she exaggerated, he said. 2 vendors invoked a clause that allowed termination for convenience. The chief financial officer spoke in a tone that suggested the weight he carried could not be measured on a scale. If the Treasury hold remains longer than 2 weeks, our covenant will be at risk. Bay Bridge Partners, the consulting firm whose slides had promised ease, sent a brief note that implementation risk resided with the client. Do not attempt to shift responsibility to Ms. Hale in any public statement, Carla added. It would be inaccurate and may invite defamation claims, which in turn would invite further oversight. Outside the boardroom windows, the afternoon light thinned. Inside, the distance between options narrowed until it felt like a corridor. Richard looked at Dylan. He said, "We will contact Morgan. We will offer a temporary contract of 6 weeks. She restores access. We revet a successor in parallel." The call rang and did not connect. A new message arrived from a prime contractor with work that touched national infrastructure. "We are attempting to finalize the statement of work for March. The approval portal is requesting the designated compliance officer's signature or a documented escalation from a registered officer. Who signs now?" No one answered. Elaine folded her hands. She did not sigh. She told Dylan, "You have 24 hours. Deliver a lawful plan to restore a designated compliance officer without violating any statute or regulation." Dylan looked down at his notes as if they belonged to someone else. He nodded once. He did not speak. The room recognized the truth that crossed his face and for a moment looked away as if to grant him privacy within a loss. Beyond the glass windows, the city's lights began to kindle in a slow, deliberate pattern. Inside, the boardroom lights felt too bright. The company had replaced a load-bearing wall with a storyboard, and the storyboard was sliding down the varnished table, scattering paper clips like small, useless anchors. The hour hand moved. The plan did not. Morning arrived like a sealed envelope. At 7:12, Richard Ames stepped through the revolving doors of ArcLight Systems with the set jaw of a man who had already heard the verdict and came anyway. His tie was not quite straight. The lobby flowers looked newly watered and faintly embarrassed. In the operations suite, a red banner pulsed on a wall display that usually showed harmless dashboards. At 7:24, the protocol Morgan Hale had authored years ago slid into place with quiet certainty. The company entered level red. The chief financial officer hurried to the governance console and tried to open the risk platform. The screen accepted his password and rejected his hope. Signature authority not found. He moved to the procurement integrated enterprise environment, the portal that governed invoices and acceptance for defense work. Submissions returned at once. Rejected, invalid designated compliance officer signature. Treasury notifications stacked like narrow tombstones. Payment hold extended due to non-compliant signatory. The room filled with the pale light of monitors and the hard light of consequence. Carla Nguyen stood with her hands folded. She spoke in the even tone of a steward at the helm of a vessel in heavy weather. Without a designated compliance officer, every self-certification is void. The systems are functioning exactly as they were designed to function. We must decide what we will lose by choice or wait to discover what we will lose by force. An emergency session gathered in the boardroom. The city beyond the glass had not yet found its color, and the faces at the table seemed lit from the inside by a colder sun. Elaine Porter addressed the room with the steadiness of a metronome. "Who holds the federal designation at this moment?" she asked, "and who is authorized to act in that role?" "No one," Carla said. The word did not echo. It absorbed the air and gave back a thin silence. Elaine inclined her head, and Carla continued. "We have 3 lawful paths. The first is to revet a new candidate through the issuing agencies. The process requires 90 to 180 days, and we must accept the risk of losing active contracts. The second is to contract Miss Hale as interim designated compliance officer, if she will agree, and to restore access under her authority while we revet a successor. The third is to pause operations voluntarily, disclose fully to partners and agencies, and preserve our legal position while sacrificing revenue and momentum." Dylan Rourke leaned forward. His voice was measured, but a wire in it had begun to hum. "Is there a way for another executive to sign temporarily, only to bridge the week?" Carla shook her head. "No. A federal designation is bound to identity, training, and clearance. Attempting to sign in the name of a former officer or directing another to do so is not a bridge, it is a breach that may constitute a felony. We will not do that." Something in Dylan's posture gave. It was not dramatic. It was the inward motion of a man who has reached the last page of an argument and found it blank. Richard looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained both disappointment and recognition. Then he stepped aside, took out his phone, and dialed a number he had dialed many times without success. For a long breath, the room heard nothing except the fan of the projector and the distant, regular click of a heating unit. Then the line connected. "Morgan Hale," she said. Richard did not waste a syllable. He stood by the window where the light was severe. "Did you disable the core?" On the line, a pause opened and closed, as precise as a hand on a latch. "No," Morgan said. "I just took my name off it." She did not speak again. She did not breathe into the room. She allowed the sentence to land and to build its own architecture there. Richard lowered the phone. He did not look at Dylan. He did not look at anyone. It was the first mercy of the day. What followed took only minutes and felt like months. A prime contractor sent an email with a subject line that did not shout and did not ask. Immediate hold under Section 4.2. The company listing on the Federal Registry shifted from active to a clear verdict. Inactive due to missing designated compliance officer. Human Resources leadership resigned with a brief note that cited personal reasons and meant institutional reasons. The consulting firm that had written the optimistic slide withdrew from the room and from the problem. The Compensation Committee opened a folder titled Equity Adjustments in Extraordinary Events, and no one wanted to turn the first page. Inside the building, the day moved forward as if on a track. Outside, Seattle brightened slowly, as if reluctant to reveal the outline of a story unfolding behind glass. In the war room, the chief financial officer returned with a list of decisions that would save time and lose money. Procurement sent cancellations they prayed not to send. Legal drafted letters without adjectives. The work had the feel of a careful dismantling. The company did not collapse. It was unfastened. In a house 5 miles north, winter sunlight lay across a small square of lawn. Morgan watered the rosemary in the back garden, then came inside and wiped a ring of moisture from the counter with the side of her palm. She opened her laptop and read 3 acknowledgments, one from the liaison to the revenue authorities, one from the General Services Administration, and one from the Oversight Office that had learned her voice during difficult years.
Each message confirmed the same thing in a different tone. They had received and recorded her change of role. Her name no longer bound ArcLight Systems to the powers that had once trusted it. She did not celebrate, and she did not mourn. She walked to the window and opened it to the midday air. The quiet that entered the room was not absence. It was a structure with weight and volume. She had chosen it. It had chosen her back. When Richard returned to the boardroom, the light had shifted to a flatter angle. He set the phone face down and did not speak for a moment. Elaine met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture that meant, "We will proceed without ceremony." Carla summarized the disclosures, the steps, and the schedule. Leo Barrett noted the equipment that would need to be secured and the data that would need to be sealed. Dylan signed a form that would live in a file where stark memos go when their purpose is to teach a lesson costlier than a seminar. The building continued to hum. The company still had walls and chairs and people whose work was honest and heavy, but the frame that kept the law upright had been removed, and the remaining structure understood it as an ache understands the bone. A narrator might be tempted to say they lost a person. That would be too small and too sentimental. They removed the structure that held their name together, and the name learned how much it had leaned. In the final minutes of the day, the story does not try to redeem itself with a flourish. It closes its own folders, it darkens its own screens. It lets the reader stand up and walk toward the door with a clearer sense of what matters when a company creates a simple sentence, like, "We certify." If you have ever been the quiet beam that carried the floor while the lights took the applause, leave a note below and tell the room what it weighs to hold. If this story met you where you work, subscribe and return for the next quiet victory. Some endings do not burn. They simply remove a name from a place where only the right name can stand. And then, they let the wind move through what remains.